Thank you. I'm very grateful that you came. We had no idea how many people were going to show up, but I'm happy that you came. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I hear.
You can hear, okay, because this is the mic that I need to use, this one. The other mic that I have on me is for the cable telecasting it. So we're working with two mics tonight. Well, the title of my talk, Victorian Flowers We Still Love. That title has two elements to it. One is, it's going to be about plants, about flowers, but it's also going to be a little bit about history because it's Victorian. So it's the Victorian era, 1830, 1840 until 1900, when Queen Victoria reigned in England. And that whole period of time had a great impact here in the United States as well. A lot of things that were happening there, we replicated here. And gardening is one of them. The way the English gardened is the way we gardened in the 19th century because we didn't have any history of gardening, whereas the English did. So we're gonna take a trip tonight, and we're gonna look at how we came to plant the flowers we put in our garden. It just didn't happen by accident. Somebody was there saying, this plant is better than this one. This flower is better than this one. Somebody was telling people for generations, this is the kind of garden you need to have. And specifically, this is the kind of flower garden you have. And one group of people that did that was the company of seed distributors or nurseries around the country. They were the ones that had the plants first. They're the ones that experimented with plants. So they're the ones that sold us a lot of what we have. And one of the most important sales people from the 19th century who sold us the flower garden we have is James Vick, V-I-C-K. Mr. Vick was born in England, but he came with his mother and father here to the US and began a career as a writer and an editor, and then went into the seed business because he was interested in horticulture. What we're going to look at is how he chose plants to sell. These plants rather than these plants. And he was one of the most important seed company owners in the 19th century. So his ideas are still dominant today, believe it or not. So let us begin. We're going to look at Vick. Vick was from Rochester, New York, by the way. I started work on this book when we used to go to Rochester. This is a little side story. We used to go to Rochester to visit our friends. And as you know, probably, if you have ever made the trip, driving from here, Quincy, to Rochester is a long drive, a long, long drive. We would leave at 9 in the morning and we get there like 4 o'clock or something. It was just a long drive. And you had to stop every couple of hours for a little rest. So while we were there, I would often go to the library. Since I'm a researcher, I would often go to the historian. I would often go to the library and find out something about horticulture in Rochester. And that's where I discovered James Vick. Does that person want to get in here?
I don't know, I'll find out. Oh, hi, welcome.
Please come in. So that's how I first met Mr. Vick, by going to research facilities in Rochester when we were visiting there. And I discovered Vick's seed catalog. I discovered also his magazine and his books that he wrote. And in all of that research, I found out also the kinds of flowers that he liked. So we're going to talk about him as a writer, as a horticulturalist, and as a marketer, one who sold these plants all around the country. From Maine to California, the same flowers were being grown no matter where you lived. Everybody had the same plants because they were the ones that were being sold. It wasn't that there were a lot of other plants. There are millions of plants that were possible, but the ones that actually made it into the garden were quite a smaller number than that. So first, Vick the writer. This is an important skill that he developed early on, and it enabled him to really create a wonderful catalog and a wonderful magazine. And as we will see, it was through a period of time before he actually got into horticulture. He was born in 1818 in Portsmouth, England. Now, if you know anything about English history, Portsmouth is right on the water, and many, many ships were built there over the centuries that contributed to English imperialism. In other words, the big ships went to Africa, Asia, went to China, went to South America in search of land that the English could dominate. And a lot of those big ships came from Portsmouth. It was a big, big a seaport, much like Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Portsmouth, New Hampshire is named after this city. Portsmouth, New Hampshire, if you know that area, has the shipyard where the U.S. government builds ships. So it's kind of the same background. He came to New York, first of all, with his parents in 1833. So he was a teenager. And he got a job working on the Knickerbocker magazine with Horace Greeley, who founded that magazine. Horace Greeley was a wonderful, colorful character in the 19th century. He was a politician, a writer, an editor, and he was very vocal about his opinions on slavery, on women's right to vote. He had very, very strict opinions on all of these, and sometimes he got elected because of them, sometimes he did not get elected because of those opinions. But he was a very powerful character, and Vic remains a friend of his throughout his life. Then Vic moved to Rochester in 1837, and Vic became the foreman for the publication that Frederick Douglass edited and produced, called the North Star. He was his foreman. Now, the foreman means the person in the company who organizes the typesetting, the writing, the editing, the layout, who organizes all of that and makes sure the publication gets out. So you don't actually write anything, but you do organize the publication. It was a very important job. And the fact that Douglass should hire Mr. Vic for this job indicates the ability that he had at the ripe age of 30. He had the ability to run a publication. And he also then, shortly thereafter, worked for Genesee Farmer. This was a agricultural magazine that gave farmers ideas for improving their crops, new machinery that they needed, and there was usually a section in the magazine for horticulture as well. Remember, there were not a lot of newspapers and magazines. There were limited publications like this that people could read. There was no radio, there was no media, no internet, of course, none of that. It was really the magazines which were the major, and the newspapers. Newspapers were a penny, were daily newspapers. In big cities and in small towns were weeklies. Now, Andrew Jackson Downing is a character that Vic encounters in the 1840s. And he lived outside of New York City, north of New York City, and he was the most important landscape designer at that time in America. And he loved the English garden design, and whenever he did a landscape design for anybody, he always did the English garden. He presented that format. But unfortunately, he died in an accident on the Hudson River. He was in his early 40s, a terrible accident. He was publishing at that time The Horticulturalist, a very important magazine on landscape design. And all of his ideas came from England. So he was like an American who spread the ideas of English garden design, English landscape, particularly the lawn, and no shrubs on the house. Those were two of the important elements. No shrubs or vines leaning against the house, only lawns. Lawns were really important. It isn't until 1900 that we begin to have what we call foundation planting, where people put a shrub against the house or a vine up the wall of the house. The garden design before that never admitted any of that. Early and late Victorian design never admitted any landscape plantings against the house. We'll see some examples of that. Then Vic was horticultural editor of Moore's Rural New Yorker. This is another publication in that greater Rochester area that he was involved in. We've already seen 3 that he was involved in. I didn't say this about Downing. Downing had a magazine called Horticulturalist. I said that. But when he died, Vic bought the magazine and published it in Rochester. He left the editorial board down there, and he published everything in Rochester for this magazine. But he sold it in a year because it had no nursery, it had no greenhouse behind it to fund it. It had only subscriptions, and that couldn't carry it. So after 1 year, he sold it to Thomas Meehan in Philadelphia. But the fact that he bought that magazine and he published it indicates something about Vic, that he loved the English garden design. So Vic is now going to become a voice for that same design that Downing was proposing. There was always a battle between designers, landscape designers, which is the predominant one, the formal or the informal. The English design is basically quite informal. All it has is lawn and a few trees popped here and there with a flower bed. That's about it. But in the formal design of the French, you had very strict lines. You had what you had on this side, you had imitated on this side. It was a totally opposite. Formal versus natural, it was called. And that was really, really a very big debate for a long time. His first seed catalog appeared in 1862. This is important. So now for 20 years, he is in the writing business, writing and publishing business. And now in 62, he decides to get into the seed business. So he publishes his catalog called Illustrated Catalog. Floral Guide, that was the name of it, Floral Guide. This is a very fancy Victorian kind of style of design. Vic wrote in 1873, "Could we spare the time from our other duties, nothing would please us more than to visit our friends monthly." So now he writes down, I think I would like to publish a monthly garden magazine, and that's exactly what he eventually winds up doing. So Vic began a monthly magazine called Vic's Illustrated Monthly. This was the premier garden magazine of the 19th century. This was a magazine that everybody was copying. It was issued monthly and had wonderful articles, essays, and of course, Vic recommended all kinds of seeds and plants that you might put into your garden. It is designed to spread the taste for the beautiful all over the land. Vic saw his role to spread the love of floriculture, which meant he was spreading the love of putting flowers around your house in flower gardens. That was his one mission in life, to spread the love of floriculture. It's a beautiful example. Now, Vic the horticulturalist. So far, we saw how Vic developed his writing skills. Now, how he became interested in planting. He began his seed business in the early 1860s in his own yard. You can see on the left there, he has little low hothouses where he was planting seeds and watching them grow right at his house. That's his house. And he would dry out the seeds and he would package them in the attic of his house right here. And in the morning, his sons, he had 7 or 8 children, and this one child died very early. That's why he wound up with 7 who actually survived. And they would help him with his seed business. They would take them the next morning to the post office. He would get letters from all over the country eventually. 3,000 letters a day he would get in the big seasonal period. So this was his business. He was providing this taste for flowers. He wasn't selling vegetables at the beginning. Eventually he did. I will talk about this in a moment when I talk about gardening in the 19th century. Each day Vic received 3,000 letters and filled 300 orders. This is during the busy time of seed selling, which is of course early spring, like right now, like March and April. They're all dried out there and they're being packaged and ready to send. So this is a big time. He wouldn't do much of this in the summer. He would do some of it, but most of the seeds come in the spring and in the fall. He included in the catalog at least one colored illustration, like this annual phlox. He wanted people to see the actual colors. And he always had them done in the most popular art form, and this is chromolithography. This is where people would create an image as a painting, and then people would copy it and would paint stones the colors they needed, and they would put the piece of paper over the stones, and then they would press it, and that would replicate the image on the paper. So it was a very slow process, but a beautiful process that created these beautiful images. Now, this is an example of an illustration that appeared in his catalog often. Now, notice a couple of things here. There are two women playing croquet in the front. There are two people sitting on the swing, wooden swing in the back there. And on the left is the house. Now, notice there are no shrubs right in front of the house. There are shrubs and flower beds on the lawn. So that's in keeping with Victorian design. Now, Vic's goal was to spread the love of flowers like this dahlia. He loved dahlias. This is his seed company. Now, believe it or not, this is 1880. This is 18 years after he began his company in his attic. He has a 4-story building just down the street from his house. So it tells you how much his business had grown over all those years, 18 years. Now notice on the lawn, you see nothing but a couple of collections of flowers near the door, and then at the sidewalk, you see a vase. I'll talk about the vase at this time, the outdoor vase, as an important symbol for using flowers. He called himself the importer and grower of flower seeds. Now, he grew a lot of the seeds, but he also imported them from Germany, from England, from France, seeds, so that he could sell them here. And he promised his customers that if you didn't get anything to grow, I will give you new seeds the next season. He was really dependable that way. He just didn't scam people. He was very concerned about his customers succeeding. And he gave very careful instructions on how to plant the seeds. This was also important. In a letter in the magazine, a reader said, "History will yet tell what you have done by cultivating a taste for flowers in Republican America." People were recognizing you are spreading the love of flowers, which is what he wanted to do. He's actually doing it, so it's good to see that. Now I want to say something about the 19th century garden in America. From Jefferson's time, the late 1700s into the early 1800s, from Jefferson's time until about 1850, the only growing that people did was for vegetables, to survive. People the ordinary person was not growing flower gardens until 1850 and 1860. Everybody was living on farms and just surviving on the vegetables that they could grow. But after 1850 and 1860, we introduced in this country what we call industrialized products. Everything was being produced on the line. Clothing, shoes, food like Heinz 57 varieties of different canned and bottled foods that people would buy instead of making it themselves. That all began after 1860. So people had more leisure time and more money, and they could therefore create a flower garden. So that's when we see flower gardens take off after 1860. All over the country. All over the country. This is a vegetable seed ad in Vic's magazine. But it was, by mid-century, flowers became essential. You must have a flower garden. Now, women formed the primary audience of the garden catalog. So women were the ones who designed, installed, and took care of the flower garden. This was very important for selling seeds and for the role of women in the culture at this time. Here's a woman who's planting in a bed. And notice that the flowers, the plants are in these tiny seed packets. What are those called? Canvas. So people put those right in the ground. There was a great interest both in England and America in making sure women were respected as gardeners. In England, Louisa Johnson wrote the book called Every Lady Her Own Flower Gardener. So you didn't need somebody to come in and do the flower garden. You could do it yourself. So she wrote a book called Every Lady Her Own Flower Garden. That means you can do it yourself. You don't have to depend on anybody. If you have to dig a big hole, of course, you might need some help. But the ordinary everyday stuff you can do. And that idea was quite popular in England, that women can take care of the garden. She wrote, flower gardening has progressed rapidly and has become the dominant passion of the ladies of Great Britain. Carpet bedding and borders became important, with annuals in the flower bed. Now this is an image of a geranium. Geranium was probably the #1 plant in the Victorian garden, 19th century. And today the geranium continues to be a big seller, geranium. They're beautiful. There are many, many varieties. It continues to be a big seller today. People wanted a garden that looked like the one in the catalog. Now here's a flower bed on the lawn in Vick's Floral Guide of 1882. And people wanted a garden of flowers just like this, in circles. So the higher the closer to the center, the higher the flower was. So it went up like that. So people wanted something like that. And Vick proposed what flowers you could put in there. Tremendous idea and helpful for the gardener. Not only did you know what it was supposed to look like, but you knew exactly what you needed to put to create that kind of flower garden. Vick's Floral Guide of 1882. And this is one of the flowers that he sold. This is sweet pea. Sweet pea is an important Victorian plant which we still grow today. It's a popular plant. Vick became a major voice in spreading floriculture, his one goal in life. This is an article and an illustration from a magazine called American Agriculturalist. And it was probably the most important magazine in the country for farming and gardening. Now notice here, the lawn with a flower bed, circular flower bed right in the middle. There is no bush against the house. There is no vine on the house. See how consecutive that design is over and over and over again. People see it in imagery. They know, I don't grow a shrub against the house. I don't grow a vine crawling up the house like we have today. Today we have all kinds of rhododendron, laurels growing against the house, and they go up to the second floor. That's not Victorian style. It's actually not a good style at all. It should be trimmed. It should not go to the second floor. It should be trimmed by the windows, by the beginning of the windows of the first floor, because it looks untidy. If you want a neat landscape. Now this is the vase. This is what Vick said about the vase. I heard this at the Boston Flower Show a couple of years ago when it was still being held. I was there in 2020 when the show was on, and that was when the COVID people were really trying to figure out what to do with COVID. And I was hosting one of the booths there, and a guy from the flower show came over and he said, "I'm sorry, sir, we're closing down. Everybody has to go." And this was like Friday at noon. And of course, the flower show goes Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. But it ended at noon on that Friday because of COVID. I remember that. So we went home. But this is what somebody said at that flower show. When you create a vase for your garden, and it's a big vase, it should be big, by the way, and you shouldn't have 10 of them, you should have one big one. You should have a tall plant in the center called the thriller, a plant in the center, that's a caladium. You should have center plants that fill the space in the center. That's called a filler. Here it's a geranium. And you should have flowers that go down, and that's called a spiller. Thriller, filler, spiller. That's what you should have in 3 plants, no more than 3 plants. You could have a couple of each one, but no more than 3 because it's too confusing. So the thriller, the filler, and the spiller. And that's what we still do today. in good garden design, you always want to have one tall one and then one that fills and then one that goes down on the ground. Ever new varieties of flowers made gardening a wonderful hobby. What was happening during the 19th century, there were plant explorers going to China, to Japan, to South America, to Africa, getting plants to take back first to England and France, and then many of them would also come to the United States. These were plants that were from other cultures, but would certainly grow here. Vick took part in hybridizing. Hybridizing, of course, was another method of reproducing or producing a plant that became important in the 19th century when people could figure it out, especially through the great scientists we had at that time. Vick sold the flowers that we still grow and love today. Now, there were 4 sources for Vick's Victorian garden: native plants, English garden, exotic plants, and new hybrids. Now let me talk about each of these. This is very important. Vick just didn't pick out a plant willy-nilly. These are the 4 areas that he got all the plants that he sold from. First, native plants. He was a big advocate of native plants. Now here is New England aster. This is a native plant for us here. This is one of the ones that he sold. And this is easy to grow, as Vick said, but there are other native plants: black-eyed Susan, verbena, California poppy, gaillardia, aquilegia. These are all plants that are native that grow in this area. So, and Vick was very smart about that. He said, why get plants from outside your area? So native plants, in his choice, became quite important. The second group was called plants that came from the English garden tradition. The English garden had been in existence for centuries, and plants had been added over the centuries more and more. And this is one of the oldest plants in the English garden, nasturtium. It dates back probably to 1300, 1400. And it came from Turkey. It is not native to England, but they brought it in, and it grows very easily. If you've ever grown nasturtium, I love it. It's one of my favorite flowers. It's very easy to grow. You just have to put the seeds in the ground and it comes up. It's very easy to grow. But it is an annual for us. So that's a plant from the English garden. So that's the second one. The third one is what he calls the exotic plants. These are plants that came from other cultures, other countries, other tropical areas, for example. South America, Africa. Geranium is one of those examples. Geranium is not native to the US of A. It's native to a very warm tropical climate because it has to have that warmth to continue to grow. If you leave it outside, it freezes and it dies. You can take it inside and water it all winter and put it back out. That's easy to do with a geranium. But this is called an exotic plant. Other examples are marigold, portulaca, sweet peas, China aster. These are all plants that came from other regions of the world and were cultivated in the 19th century, and people continue to use them today. The next group, hybrids, new hybrids. Chrysanthemum is one of them. Carnation, zinnia, daylilies. These are plants that are not native, and they're not necessarily from the English garden, but they're new hybrids. People are always looking for new varieties of these older plants. So that's what Vick was selling. For example, he had a whole field of dahlias that he was hybridizing, hoping to get new varieties, which is what happened in his case. So I'm going to repeat that again. This is really important. The 4 sources for his plants: the native plants, the English garden plants, the exotic plants that came from all over the world, and then finally new hybrids. Now the plant directories. Plant directories are important because when we see a particular plant, it's easy to trace how long it's been cultivated in the garden. If we look at Philip Miller's Gardener's Dictionary, 1735, he has the nasturtium, he has the rose, He has the carnation. He has a lot of these plants that were part of the garden earlier in early centuries and continue to be so. And then another source is the Lady's Companion to the Flower Garden, Jane Loudon. And you can be sure that Mr. Vick had these resources to look up. And the third one is David Thompson's Book of the Flower Garden, which is also full of examples. So it isn't just that we're pulling these flowers out of midair. We're following a tradition of planting in various cultures, including our own, of course. And this is David Thompson's book. Vick sold flowers that had been part of the English garden for a long time, like the coleus. The coleus is one of my favorite plants because it has these beautiful leaves and it has many, many hybrids, many, many varieties. You couldn't possibly count all of them. The dahlia, for example, has 52,000 varieties of dahlias, which is just one plant all by itself. And you couldn't possibly grow very many of them because there's so many of them. You could grow, it's always better, by the way, to have several varieties of one plant rather than to have 10 varieties of the one plant. See, so in a dahlia, for example, you might have a dahlia, wonderful dahlia called Bishop of Llandaff, which is a wonderful dahlia. You'd be much better off having the one variety and having many of that plant rather than having 10 different dahlia varieties of dahlias. It looks much better in a design. The best annuals. Now, Vick was constantly asked, what is the best annual? What is the most important one that I could plant? And he often said the same ones over and over again. 12 best annuals: pansy, dianthus, sweet pea, portulaca, aster. These are ones that I've already mentioned, a lot of them. Verbena. Vick sold flowers that are still popular today. Today, the National Garden Bureau offers these flowers as the top 10 annuals for gardeners. Begonia readily available. Calibrachoa, geranium, look at geranium again. We've seen geranium already on like 5 lists as one of the most important flowers in the Victorian era, and it still is today. It's the #1 plant today, geranium, continues to be so. Pansy, petunia. Petunia is a glorious plant. 1831, came to England from South America. It is, therefore, an exotic plant, and it's been hybridized to death. For example, Proven Winners, which is a wonderful grower of plants, has a petunia called Super Tunia, which you can buy in the spring. Beautiful, beautiful plant. But it's a petunia. Vinca and sunflower. Sunflowers are a big deal today. A customer asked Vick to name what he considered the best 6 annuals. Well, he struggled with this. It's like asking a parent, which child is your favorite? He couldn't do it. So he did 4. And then he said, you choose one from these final ones I'm going to mention: Verbena, Dianthus, Morning Glory. The person had to do that. What I like about this little list is he gives 6 plants, but they're ones that he's been talking about right along in his catalog. Our readers better select the last one. And they did. And today, look at, there it is. There's your petunia. This is a petunia from Vick's catalog. The neat thing about hybridizing is this. In hybridizing, we have a new variety of an old plant. So this is a petunia. We no longer have this variety. Now we have Proven Winners Supertunia. You can't buy these old varieties anymore, most plants. There are a couple of dahlias you can buy that are from the 19th century, but most plants you have to buy the newer hybrids because that's how they make their money. But it's the same plant, but just a newer version of it. Now here are the top 10 annuals sold at Lowe's. I like Lowe's, Home Depot, I like Walmart. They sell the old classics like this: Alyssum, Amaranth, Begonia, Celosia, Heliotrope, Marigold, salvia, and zinnia. These are all available at Lowe's. And they've been in our gardens for 200 years. We're not putting anything new. What we're putting new is the new variety of this old plant. So we're always looking for new varieties. For example, my favorite variety now for Coleus is called Main Street, M-A-I-N, Main Street. It's a wonderful series of hybrid Coleus. Here are the annuals from Home Depot, top annuals that they sell: Petunia, Impatiens, Geranium, Begonia. Begonia continues to be very high in value to gardeners. It was in the 19th century and is today as well. Proven Winners lists the following among their top selling annuals: Supertunia, Calabrachia, Bacopa, Euphorbia, and Lobelia. These are old standards. Garden Design website recently listed easy to grow annuals for the garden. Zinnia, Dianthus, Marigolds, these are all, I don't want to keep reading lists. What I'm emphasizing here is they're basically the same plants. It's like a palette that is the same today that it was when Vic sold his seeds. We plant the same annuals every year. Noel Kingsbury said, new versions of familiar plants sell well. Now here's a pansy. Vic the marketer, finally. Now, so Vic is a writer. Vic knows a lot about plants. He does hybridizing, but he's also a wonderful marketer to get his message out there. He developed his business strategy, his marketing strategies to convince his customer to buy his seed. For 20 years after the Civil War, the name of James Vick was a household word in America. Everybody knew his name, from Maine to California. Also, he had orders from gardeners outside the U.S. Vick sought to establish a relationship with his customers. He was into customer service way before the word became popular. The media, especially newspapers, advertising, framed lithographs that he would give to people as a gift, and they would hang it up in their house. Awards at state fairs, these are ways that he promoted his company. Show gardens at his house. Seed clubs, fixed publications. Now the first one is the media. So of course this was newspaper and magazine. The press is one of the greatest educators in the land, and we want the people to receive a good education. So he would send stories to newspapers and they would print them. Sometimes he would send them seeds and they would publish they received his seeds and tell their readers about how well the seeds did. And since he had been in the publishing business, he knew a lot of editors and publishers, so he was able to get his company in the press. He did advertising. He spent $100,000 a year on advertising with J. Walter Thompson, who was one of the biggest advertising agencies in the country. When he died, his sons, who took over the company, stopped all advertising. They thought it was a waste of money. When they did that, they lost a humongous amount of business, because advertising means you keep your name out there over and over and over again. It's like those terrible ads we see for insurance. We see them over and over again. Oh, this was an ad that he put in the Horticulturalist. Vick's Floral Guide. It's kind of hard to read. Vick's Floral Guide. That was his catalog. But this is the Victorian style. It's very much that filigree. This is how they did it. This is his catalog from 1882. And then he would frame chromolithographs. I mentioned before that he had them in the magazine, but he also would make special ones that you could frame and hang in the parlor in your house. So you could have artwork in your house. This is called democratic art. Art for the people who are not wealthy, that you could put it in your parlor. The front room was called always the parlor in Victorian lingo. These are the chromos that he offered. These are the examples that They were, of course, colored. You could choose one of those. They cost $1. If you wanted a frame, he would put them in a frame for you. And at the bottom of it, this was very clever marketing. He would have a list of every flower that was in that design, and of course, he sold the seed to it. So you could write to him to get the seed. This is one of them. So beautiful the colors are. This is the color today. It's just as beautiful as it was when he put it out in his magazine. This is the Chromo Flowers, 1871. The artists were Walter and Ron. I want to say something about them. Remember I showed you his seed house, which had 4 stories? In that 4-story red brick building, he also had an office for the artists, for the writers and the artists, all the people who published his magazine and his catalog. So that was part of the business. He cultivated a lot of business in Rochester. This is another of his chromolithographs done up. Then he also would ask his customers, take the flowers from my seeds to the state fair in your state. And if you get a prize, tell me and I will send you some seeds. So of course people did that because they could get some free seeds. But it was a wonderful way for him to get his name out there. So he went to New York, Michigan, Wisconsin. He went to those annual state fairs in the summer, and he brought his own flowers. And then also he had, at his own house, he had fields and fields of flowers that he planted. And he would ask people, come around, walk along the roadway to my house and look at all the new flowers that I'm growing. And people would come. It's a wonderful day trip for a lot of people. And of course, if people lived too far away, they couldn't come. Now here's a mother with a daughter, it looks like, walking along there's his house in the background, where in the attic he started his company. In 1870, Moore's Rural New Yorker wrote about the fields. The gates are open and someone will point out and explain the history and the value of the many rarities. In other words, there's always somebody there to talk to when you come to my house to look at the fields of flowers. So please come. And then seed clubs. Seed clubs meant that a person in a neighborhood would gather names of other people who would buy seeds from Vic, but this person would take the names of everybody, send the money all together, and that person would receive some free seeds. And that was called a seed club. What a wonderful way to get other people interested, to be an influence for other people. Now notice this house. Lawn, of course. As a slight compensation to those who labor among their neighbors, if you did the seed club and you've got a lot of people, I would give you one of the chromos framed, which is wonderful. Look at how beautiful that wooden frame is. And then finally, Vic's publications, seed catalogs, magazines, and books. And that's how he got his word out there. So those were all the ways that he marketed his company. It was very, very powerful altogether. Through his writing, Vic's name became a household word. So Vic died May 16, 1882. And the next year, in 1883, the president of the Minnesota State Horticultural Society mentioned both Charles Darwin and James Vick in a speech that he gave. Now notice this tribute to Mr. Vick. This is what he said. I have to record the names of 2 men whose labors have been largely for the benefit of farmers and horticulturalists, Charles Darwin and James Vick. Charles Darwin, who died at the ripe age of 74. James Vick, who died at Rochester, New York, May 16, was age 64. At the time of his death, he was at the head of one of the largest seed establishments in America, and his floral guide had a circulation of over 200,000. That's his catalog. His success has been marvelous. His labors are finished, but the good he has done will endure forever. What a tribute to Mr. Vick. Comparing him with Charles Darwin and spoken by no less than the head of the Minnesota Association of Horticulture. A very, very important tribute to him. It shows you how important he was to the country at that time, both in introducing the flower garden, in selling seeds, and in promoting the love of horticulture. I want to thank you. You've been a wonderful audience, attentive. Of course, I have to say something about my book. This is the title of my book. I have copies over there if you want to look at it. All About Flowers, James Vick's 19th Century Seed Company.